Okay, hello, and welcome to Hope. Very exciting to be starting off this lunchtime with our first event. Nice to see some familiar faces and some unfamiliar faces. Great to welcome everyone here. And we're going to be hearing a talk this lunchtime. I can't say this morning, but we'll go with this lunchtime. And we've got our lovely speaker, Claire, who's with us all the way from Oxford, I believe. Yeah, so we're really looking forward to that. And we do have food today.
Yep, we have food just being prepared right now. So if you want to listen to the talk or wait for food being prepared, that would be great. And today's talk is going to be part of an events week that we're going to be doing as the Christian Union. So after the lunch, there will be, after the lunch, there will be a craft afternoon, then another talk, then another talk with dinner, and then board games for after hours. So
what a day.
If you have some time, be sure to attend some of those as well. But today's talk is going to be Hope Despite Injustice.
Great. And we should have said, my name's Ethan, and
my name is Hannah.
And we're part of the Christian Union here at Warwick, and we're putting on this whole week for people to explore what Christianity is and what it means to have Jesus as our Saviour. And we're going to be unpacking that a little bit more in a minute, so we're looking forward to that. So why don't we invite up our speaker, Claire. So why don't we give her a little round of applause. Great. So why don't you introduce yourself, Claire, and tell us a little bit about what you do and where you've come from, although I've spoiled that bit.
That's okay. I did actually come down from London today. So come up to, I can't remember, I don't know the geography, but I'm from London, and I do talks like this to think about some of the tough questions or objections to Christianity. Aside from my speaking, I am doing my PhD in sociology. So some of the issues we're going to be covering today is something I'm really working on in my kind of studies as well.
Awesome.
Great. And should we ask you in traditional fashion a slightly silly question? Have you got one, or shall I come up with one?
If you had to pick a dinosaur to be an ice cream flavor, just the basic dinosaurs, don't worry about it. Which dinosaur would you pick?
This is a dinosaur
and an ice cream flavor, of course.
To pick a dinosaur to be an ice cream flavor?
Yes.
Okay, I would pick a T-Rex to be rum and raisin.
Oh, okay.
Because it's got a bit of a punch to it.
Oh, right.
Yeah, that's my logic, anyway.
Right, yeah. I would have thought Rocky Road for
Very
T-Rex.
nice. I'm amazed you managed to use any logic with that one. So well done. Great. Well, shall I leave you to it? Great.
Just wanted to check with the tech team. Do you want me down here or up there? Up? Okay, cool. Okay, everyone, thank you so much for bearing with us for this little technical difficulty. As I said, I'm doing my PhD in sociology, and I do speaking as well. I'm convinced of the claims of Christianity, but today's all about us exploring those together. So we're going to think about this question, if I can have the clicker, please. Thinking about it in three further questions, that's okay. And they are, number one, why are we bothering to ask this question? Number two, what about the voices of the oppressed? And why, number three, why does Jesus matter? If I just could take us back there, hope despite injustice, isn't Christianity oppressive? I think that if we think about where the culture is, if you look online, social media, there is a sense, perhaps, that some people believe that Christianity is oppressive. And we're going to be thinking about, in our first question, why that is the case. So we're going to break this down, as I said. Why bother to ask the question? If we're thinking about the idea of oppression, who is oppressed and what do they actually say about Christianity? And finally, why does Jesus matter in this conversation? So first of all, why ask this question? Anybody seen Black Panther? Anybody seen that film? Yeah, Wakanda Forever, great stuff. Now, I remember watching it and thinking, this is amazing. But interestingly, Black Panther is like a litmus test. It's giving us a signal about where our culture is. This idea that Wakanda is having a war with the underworld, the water world, and it's got nothing to do with the Western world, okay? And so it's this idea that you can have an entire film that's got nothing to do with the Western world, all right? Very interesting, very similar themes to this film here. Anybody see Avatar? Yep. The beautiful land of Pandora, and you've got this indigenous group of people, and you've got Earth, who is trying to colonize it. That's some of the underlying themes of the film. So it's this idea that Earth and humanity is very, very oppressive, and it's trying to overtake beautiful indigenous Pandora. What about this film here? Anybody seen Gladiator? Interestingly, we have a black man in the middle of the Roman Empire. Now, is this a case of blackwashing? Are they trying to distort history just to be diverse? Well, actually, the guy that Denzel Washington plays is called Macrinus, and he was actually a Berber. So he would have been a man of color, not necessarily black African, but he would have been a man of color. So what's my point here? This idea that our culture is pushing back against the idea of oppression. And Christianity is often talked about, particularly in my community, as a Western religion that has imposed itself upon other people. The next couple of slides I'm going to show you a little bit controversial, but stay with me. During the 2020 Black Lives Matter protests, this guy broke the internet when he tweeted these here. He's called Sean King. He's an activist. He says, yes, all murals and stained glass windows of white Jesus and his European mother and their white friends should come down. They're a gross form of white supremacy created as tools of, our buzzword for today, oppression, racist propaganda. They should come down. Now, he doesn't mince his words. That's what he's saying here. Because remember, when we had the protests and people were going into different kind of historical locations and pulling down statues, and he says, actually, these statues, particularly in churches, are a form of supremacy. They're a form of oppression. He says, yes, I think the statues of the white European they claim as Jesus should also come down. They're a form, according to Sean King, of white supremacy, always have been. In the Bible, when the family of Jesus wanted to hide and blend in, guess where they went? Egypt, not Denmark. He says, tear them down, over tongue-in-cheek joke there. So I'm trying to illustrate for us that this is a very live question. And I go to different universities and speak to undergraduates and PhD students who the curriculum and the way that Christianity is talked about is this idea, this oppressive movement that kind of moved across the world and oppressed people and used violence in its wake. Why are we talking about this question? Well, this guy here, Jesus. And there's nothing wrong, I think, of a community depicting Jesus in their image. There's some beautiful images of Jesus in Chinese art, in Ethiopian art, because that's why the C is putting this event on today. When you become a follower of Jesus, then you kind of see him entering your neighborhood, coming into your community. However, I went to West Africa in 2019, and I was going to lots of churches. I was doing some events there, and this image of Jesus was everywhere in West Africa in 2019. So what is that saying to us? If this is the image, the universal image of Jesus, which is nothing historically accurate at all, then it's telling us there's some form of colonial baggage. There's some sort of oppression that has made this image be the universal one. Talking about why we're asking this question, is Christianity oppressive? Well, I couldn't be addressing this topic without thinking about the transatlantic slave trade. And we know we've got the receipts of how Christianity was weaponized and how the church, in some instances, was complicit. There was a thing called the slave Bible, where lots of passages were taken out of the Bible, loads of it, about 90%, and given to those who were enslaved to try and keep them coerced. This is a live question. And for you sitting here today, if you're not a Christian, you might be thinking, well, why would I want to be a part of a movement that oppresses and coerces people? That is a legitimate question. And finally, so not only are we talking about slavery as part of this conversation, we're also talking about mission work. There is a narrative that says that those who were involved in mission work did so and put down the cultures that they went to. This academic here, Mudimbe, says, the missionary does not enter into dialogue with pagans and savages, but must impose the law of God that he incarnates. This is heavy stuff. And perhaps some of you sitting here recognize this kind of feeling or this kind of view of Christianity, as I said, in your curriculums, in conversations with people. And we would be doing a disservice not to address that. So we've unpacked quite a few things there. I'm going to give you a minute together amongst yourselves to just have a little reflection, have a little discussion amongst yourselves about what I've just unpacked there for us, and we'll come back together in a moment. Just give you a little minute there to do that. Okay, I'm going to bring us back together. It's heavy stuff, right? So we've established that the reason we're asking this question today, this isn't some, for want of a better phrase, and I have trouble with how this phrase is bandied about, but this isn't some woke move of the CU. This is about discussing an issue that many of you in here may well have about Christianity. So we've discovered that we're asking this question because, there might be some Christians that I like, or there might be some ideas about Christianity that make sense to me, but I don't want to be part of a movement that seems to oppress people. So on to our next question, what about the voices of the oppressed? Now, I want to address, which I find to be an assumption within secular culture, that people who have experienced the injustice of an oppressive form of Christianity respond in two ways. Either they just pragmatically accept it and say, oh yeah, we're Christians, but they're having to do so because of the violence in which they're living under. So it's a kind of docile, uncritical acceptance. Or they're just accepting it, but they're not really compelled. They don't think that the claims of Christianity or the claims of Jesus are true. So either way, it's just we're not convinced that they take it seriously. Now, whilst there may be some people who fit that category, I think that kind of is very patronizing. Because there are many people, many voices of the oppressed who have encountered Christianity in violent ways, but actually they've seen something beyond that. They've seen something compelling about the person of Jesus. And so that attitude to say that, someone who just people who just are oppressed by Christianity pragmatically accept it, that is very condescending, and actually it's a hopeless situation. But we're discussing today hope despite injustice. So I'm going to share with you a quote from a guy I read his work quite a lot because of my studies. He's called Frederick Douglass. Anybody here read anything by Frederick Douglass? Okay, so he is a formerly enslaved African-American man, and he became free, and he became a very vocal activist, abolitionist. Powerful stuff he writes. And he says this, he doesn't mince his words. He says, the man who wields the blood-clotted cowskin, so that's a whip, during the week, fills the pulpit on Sunday and claims to be a minister of the meek and lowly Jesus. So he's pointing out the hypocrisy of an enslaver who whips him on the plantation but then stands at a pulpit to preach to him. Something's wrong with that picture. The man who robs me of my earnings at the end of each week meets me as a class leader on Sunday morning to show me the way of life and the path of salvation. He who sells my sister for purposes of prostitution stands forth as the pious advocate of purity. We are seeing layer upon layer of contradiction and hypocrisy here. He doesn't mince his words. And actually, when I was reading his narrative there, you can read it quite quickly. It's 11 chapters. It's very moving. It's a difficult read. And that point he makes about his sister, we know from a lot of historical and archival data that enslaved women had an extremely hard time because they were doubly discriminated. And I'm going to come back to that. But interestingly, in spite of this oppression, here is what Douglass continues to write. Between the Christianity of this land and the Christianity of Christ, I recognize the widest possible difference. I love the pure, peaceable, and impartial Christianity of Christ. I therefore hate the corrupt, slave-holding, women-whipping, cradle-plundering, partial, and hypocritical Christianity of this land. And I could continue to quote some more of the things he's written, and others like Mary Prince or Equiano, who were enslaved, who had to endure the injustice of how Christianity was weaponized. But actually, when they themselves learnt to read for themselves and engaged with the Christian faith, they saw something compelling about Jesus, about Christ. And we're going to get onto in our third question, why does Jesus matter? And if you notice, this isn't someone who's docilely accepting the Christian faith. He is critically able to see how it was used against him and able to condemn that whilst being compelled by the person of Jesus. And that is what we're inviting you to do this week. To investigate the claims of this Jesus. Why would somebody who had every reason to reject the faith actually follow Jesus? This isn't Stockholm syndrome. This is someone who is critically thinking. Let's continue. I mentioned about enslaved women. Well, the story goes that Frederick Douglass, in a meeting at some point, he was very frustrated and started to get a bit hopeless about the situation of slavery in America. And he was getting very hopeless. And after his kind of tirade or outburst, this woman here called Sojourner Truth, definitely read some of her work as well. She's a Christian. She, in a gravelly voice, after Douglass was speaking, said this: "Is God dead?" That's what she said. She asked the question, is God dead? That is the question of a woman whose children, I think she had about 13 children, a lot of them were taken away from her. A lot of them died because of the conditions in which she lived. She was abused. She was treated badly. If you read some of these accounts of what happened on plantations, it would sick you to your stomach. But yet she had hope in the person of Jesus. Is God dead? She asked that powerful question. And to me, that kind of situation warrants investigation. I'm going to talk about another issue that I know is very live in our culture, and I'm not asking you where you land on it politically or sociologically. I'm just asking you to hear what I'm saying about the voices of the oppressed, because I do find that secular culture just finds that people who are religious and who've experienced an oppressive form of Christianity are just docile. And I don't think that's the case. Am I saying that the weaponizing or violent ways that Christianity has been used is right? Absolutely not. And as you can see from the work of Douglas and Sojourner Truth and others, they're not saying that. But they find something compelling about Jesus. So this topic is, the quote I'm going to show you next is from a person who lives and knows very much of what's happening right now in Palestine, in Gaza. And this person is a Palestinian, okay, and is a Christian. And this is what he has to say. He says, our perspectives are shaped by our social, political, educational, and religious locations. He says, I read scriptures as a Palestinian who holds Israeli citizenship. And you can see that he's kind of thinking about maybe what some people might say the contradictions in that identity. I don't claim that my Palestinian reading or culture is superior. My reading challenges those who overlook, here it is again, the centrality of Christ. There's something about this person, Jesus. And those that abuse the text in order to spread a view that empowers the oppressor rather than the oppressed. It challenges ethnocentric and nationalist perspectives. And we know, I've seen it online, you don't have to tell me twice how Christian nationalist rhetoric is being plastered on what's happening in Gaza. And I'm not asking you to make a decision about to tell me what you think about that. I'm saying this is part of the live conversation that we're having. And so this man is a follower of Jesus, despite the ways that Christian nationalist rhetoric has kind of made the situation worse, exacerbated the situation. So what do we find about these voices of the oppressed? They're able to critique the ways that Christianity has been used to oppress them. They're able to condemn those things, and yet they show a commitment to this person, Jesus. Friends, that warrants investigation. One analogy I can use, imagine you have a woman who is married, and in that marriage she experiences domestic violence, okay? And she gets out of the marriage and she's able to campaign and become a great activist for women's protection in terms of marriages and against violence. But then a few years later, she gets married again. We might turn around and say to her, how could you get married again? You experienced violence in that marriage. What is wrong with you? And actually, that would be incredibly condescending, because there's a difference between, oh, wow. that wakes us up. There's a difference between a marriage that is loving, that is healthy, that is safe, and a marriage that is violent and oppressive. And that is a crude analogy to show what I'm trying to say. The violent ways that Christianity has been used are unequivocally wrong. We've got the receipts. We know. I'm not here to pretend. However, there are people who've lived through that, critique it, condemn it, and yet they're committed to Jesus. We're coming into land, friends. So I'm going to give you just another minute to kind of reflect on what I've just said there, and we'll be back for our last question. Okay, we're gonna come back together. So I think in that last section of the talk was trying to establish how we should be very careful not to reproduce the same oppression, okay, by assuming that people who are followers of Jesus are doing so because they have to pragmatically. perhaps they're convinced that it's true. We don't want to reproduce the same kind of reading or stereotypes. So why does Jesus matter? And I'm looking at my time here, and I think I might have to move some things about. I'm not sure. Yeah? Time? How much time have I got left? No idea. I'll try and be really quick. Okay. So why does Jesus matter? Well, in the accounts that we have of the life of Jesus, and they are based upon eyewitness testimonies, so the books of Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, okay, we have an account of Jesus where his two followers, James and John, they go to this town, and it's a Samaritan town. And the Samaritan town is kind of ethnically and religiously different to Jesus' own kind of ethnic group, so the Jewish culture. So Jesus sends his followers into this town to share his message, yeah? But in that Samaritan town, and it was kind of like a very strong kind of conflict between the two groups, the Samaritans said, we don't want to hear your message. And so James and John go back to Jesus and say, look, they don't want to hear our message, Jesus. Should we call fire down from heaven and burn them up? I'm from London. Should we burn them up? Should we burn up this town? And Jesus, you can see there, he says, no, you're not going to burn this town down because they don't want to accept the message that I have. That's a Samaritan town, very, very different to Jesus' own ethnic culture and group. So we've got this form of violently attacking those who don't want to accept. And I think that's what that critic I mentioned before, Mudimbe, was getting at there. But then in another passage, and again these accounts of the life of Jesus, we see where Jesus goes and talks to a woman who is a Samaritan. She is a woman, she's a Samaritan, okay? She's a little bit kind of like a pariah from her community because she's going to collect water at an odd time of day. And in this town, Jesus sits down and has a conversation with her. And this is so wild because Jesus' own followers, his disciples, are thinking, we get this note in the passage, what is he doing talking to her? And they're surprised and shocked, not because Jesus did some miracle, but because he's talking to a Samaritan woman. And in this town, when Jesus has this conversation with her, she becomes a follower of Jesus. And then her townspeople, they decide to follow Jesus because of what they've heard. What's my point here? These Samaritans who decided to follow Jesus and decided to live their life by his teachings, they didn't suddenly turn into another race or another culture. They stayed in their Samaritan skin and they followed Jesus. So you've got a clear contrast here. Why does Jesus matter? Because when we see accounts of Jesus stepping into it and addressing different cultures, he is against violence and actually invites conversation. And that's what this week is about. Come and have a conversation with the CU about this person of Jesus. And finally, why does Jesus matter? Well, when we think about the person of Jesus, he was someone who was born into humble circumstances. His family were poor. We know that by the type of offerings or the type of gifts that his family brought to the temple when he was born. They brought the cheap stuff. He was poor. Jesus faced an unfair trial. The time of day they did his trial was completely the wrong time, and there were witnesses who were saying awful things about him. Jesus challenged the religious elite in his community. His parents were refugees. He lived under the occupation of the Roman Empire. He fraternized with outcasts, people who other people didn't want to talk to. That's who Jesus spoke to. Using our language today, you could say he spoke truth to power. He was criminalized. They assumed that he was up to no good. And finally, he endured a humiliating execution. And crucifixion, we know from historical records by like Cicero, was a type of punishment reserved for non-Roman citizens. So this was designed to humiliate and to create pain. What's my point here? That Jesus doesn't matter just because of how he treated other people, or because he himself endured injustice. And according to the Christian faith, didn't just die on a Roman cross, but actually rose again 3 days later. That's a conversation for another time. But that living Jesus is the reason we have hope. Sometimes things are a little bit easier to endure and to handle when we know that the person next to us has also gone through that. That is one of the unique claims of the Christian faith, that God stepped into human history and lived a life like the one that we would live. One that wrestles with injustices of every kind that we have never asked for, and yet brings hope. That is the invitation we have this week. That you would explore the claims of this Jesus who endured injustice himself and gives hope to those who faced it. Thank you so much for listening, and we're going to have a time of questions shortly.
Thank you. That's really wonderful message to hear. And we're going to have a very short Q&A before we go and have some lunch. So we're going to put a Slido up on the screen. You can also just put your hand up. We don't really mind. But why don't we just take, the Q&A will only be about 5 minutes or so. So why don't we just take 2 minutes just to chat with each other. You can either submit your question up there, or you can stick your hand up in a couple of minutes. Great. Great. Well, let's crack on with a bit Q&A. While we've got Claire here, why don't you ask her your questions that you have?
Lots of interesting questions up there.
So, here we go.
All right, so Claire, I think the first question is quite good. Clearly it is wrong for Jesus to be portrayed as European, but is it any better for him to be portrayed as Indian or Chinese or African rather than a Jew?
Thank you for the question. I think there was a BBC documentary which it was called Son of God, and an anthropologist was able to give us like an image of what Jesus might have looked like, making it more historically accurate. So do just Google Son of God image of Jesus and you'll see what it came up as. So my point was not to try to create a competition between portrayals of Jesus. That's not what the point was. I don't think it's any better or worse. What I'm saying is that if a group of people of a particular ethnic background decide to become followers of Jesus and paint images of him in their likeness, to me that is a testament of how close or how convinced they are of Jesus and how much Jesus has entered their neighborhood, entered their culture. So I don't think it's a question of competing or which one is better. I'm not saying that. But when one image, namely a European one, is universal, we need to ask why. In the middle of, as I said, West Africa in 2019, we need to ask why. And I think that, for me, is the issue. So portray Jesus in any ethnic background if you want to. So I think that's saying, look, Jesus is part of our community. But I don't think it's about which one is better. And also, indeed, look at a more historically accurate image of what Jesus would look like.
Yeah, and it's worth remembering as well, isn't it, that Jesus was a real man who walked on this earth, and he had an ethnicity just like everyone else did. And even if we don't have any photos of him, we can still know about him. We've had a few more questions in. I'm going to ask you, this one I think is quite interesting. Why does God allow corrupt governments?
Yeah, that's a whole talk. We could do a 25-minute talk on that topic as well. I would want to affirm the anger behind this question about corrupt governments. Why are they there? And I believe that the Christian worldview affirms that anger too. That actually, if we look at the whole kind of narrative of the Bible and the Christian message, God's intention was never for corruption to be the case. But the Christian story says that we've turned away from God, and because of that turning away, these corruptions exist. And actually, the Christian message also believes, not just from the beginning that we've turned away, but in the end of all things, there will be a day of justice, a day of reckoning, where the God of the Bible will deal with those who are corrupt. And I think it's a beautiful thing to bear in mind, that God doesn't like this and allow them because he doesn't care, but there is going to be a day of reckoning where those who've been corrupt will have to face those consequences. But do come tomorrow, where I believe there's a talk on suffering and injustice and corruption and those sorts of things. There will be a talk on that tomorrow. A dear friend of mine, Tom, I believe, so he'll be exploring that a little bit more. I can only do so much in a 2-minute response.
Awesome. Just one more question, maybe to wrap it up. Doesn't becoming a Christian in oppressive circumstances just give you a crutch to get through? What genuine hope does Christ bring to those circumstances?
Yeah, I think this question, I'm going to push back on it a little bit. It assumes that Christianity, or any religion, let's say, is a crutch, rather than could it actually be true. And again, it's doing that kind of, I would say, patronizing thing where we're assuming that those who follow Jesus in difficult circumstances are not critically thinking, or not able to critically think. So, and it could be that Christianity in those circumstances is both of those things. It is a crutch. It does give you hope, but it could also be true. In the same way, I'll give you this example. I think it was Professor Stephen Hawking, who said words to the effect, I'm paraphrasing, Christianity or religion is for those who are afraid of the dark. And then John Lennox quipped back and said, well, atheism is for those people who are afraid of the light. Yeah? So the point is, we've all got our crutches somewhere that we lean on. The question is it true? Now, my point is that those who endured the suffering of oppression, perhaps their sincerity invites us to investigate, is this thing actually true, that people would suffer and die in circumstances on the basis of their faith? And let us not have, which I could only describe as a kind of secular, condescending attitude towards people in these circumstances. So could it be a crutch? Yeah. But it could also be true. And that's what we want. Just because someone isn't religious, perhaps their atheism, as John Lennox said, is their crutch, is there a way to get around and through life.
Right, thank you so much.
Great. Obviously, there's more questions on there. We can't get through them all in the public Q&A, but Claire will be around, and there's lots of members of CU around who can have a go at answering your questions. And also, it's worth saying, we're here for a whole week, which is very exciting. And we're going to spend the rest of this week digging into topics similar to this, but not exactly the same, digging into difficult issues that, we're going to that may be on your mind, or maybe they might try to address some of the questions that you have.
Yeah, and if you want to ask any questions to Claire specifically, she will be just hanging around at the end after this, so feel free to approach her and ask more questions.
Yeah. So do come back. On your way out, there's going to be hopefully some timetables of the week. They're just kind of at the back on your way out, and there'll be some in the tent as well in case you missed them. So I guess maybe a challenge would be maybe highlight like a couple of them that are happening in the rest of the week and that you find the question of really interesting. Highlight them, see if you can make them, commit to making one or two more at least big questions, and see what you find out. And yeah, just we're here as well, like all day, every day. Just there'll be people around for a chat. Have a look at the bookstall as well. And I think we're going to go and get some lunch in a minute.
Yep, so for lunch, I think that's going to be happening in the tent, which will just be, if you go out of this room and then just turn, what direction is that? Right, and then forward again, because the exit's right there, actually, you'll see it, it's common sense. You can also just leave through the way you came, which is the main entrance for the junction. Yeah, and if you want to come back again here later, the back door we don't have keycard access to, but you can go through just the normal way you would enter junction.
Yeah, so don't feel like you have to rush out. Feel free to stick around, chat to people, chat to Claire. And yeah, we'd love to hear your questions in a bit more detail. But yeah, do head out to the tent and grab some lunch. And thanks so much for coming, everyone.